Today, we're going to consider the eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Did anyone actually see the risen Jesus after he rose from the dead? And the answer is yes. But as we get into this, we need to understand that it's important that we look at this at least with the kind of way that we would look at any other historical event. There's so many things that we know happened in the past, and we weren't there to see them, right? Like, say, Napoleon's conquest of the known world. We know that happened. How about Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses on the church door? How about the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima? How about Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address? How about 9/11? Some of us, most of us were alive. These younger generation, they weren't alive at that time, but we saw it on TV. But how do these younger people know that it happened? They know it happened because eyewitnesses wrote about it. We know that many things in history happened and we weren't there to see them, but we read things that other people wrote. And that's the same thing that we have in the Bible with the eyewitnesses about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. When somebody is an eyewitness, we tend to trust what they're saying. And if there are many eyewitnesses that say basically the same thing, it even gives more credibility to what they're saying. So I want to look at what Luke wrote first. Luke wrote the book of Acts. Luke was a very detailed historian. Maybe not by trade, but he really wanted to understand this and really want to share with us things about Jesus. And so he was very thorough about his work. And so we're going to look at his work here in Acts chapter 1. The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until the day in which he was taken up, after he, through the Holy Spirit, had given commandments to the apostles whom he had chosen, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them during 40 days and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God. So Luke shows up on the scene here after Jesus rose from the dead. And he says, look, I have talked to people, I've interviewed people, and there are infallible proofs because of so many eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at some of these today here that we have in the New Testament who actually saw the resurrected Christ. So here we are. The first one, we have the gospel writers. Now, who were the gospel writers? The gospel writers were Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples. Mark. We believe this is probably John Mark, who traveled with Peter, with Paul later on in his life. So he would have heard a lot of the testimonies, the same ones that Paul had, and known a lot of the same people. But it's also very possible that he was actually the young man who, when they were betraying Jesus in the garden, that somebody grabbed him and he ran away naked and left his clothes there with the guy. It's possible that that was actually the same guy. So he would have been around and he would have seen later the risen Jesus, and he would have been a good testimony. Then we have Luke. Luke himself, he was not an eyewitness, but he was very detailed in his interviewing of other people. And so he says, I've talked to plenty of people, and to me, infallible proofs that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And then, of course, we have John, the last gospel writer, who was a very close personal friend of Jesus. We could maybe argue even that he was Jesus' best friend. And so he also was a witness. So the gospel writers knew that Jesus had risen. But you might say, how can we trust what the gospel writers wrote? Well, that's really the subject for another video, but really quickly, when we look at the gospels, and we can say the gospels each have enough similar information where we can trust them. Remember, they're 4 different books under one cover, so it's not one work, okay? They have similar information, but they also have enough varying information to let us know that they weren't just sitting down and copying off each other. There was no plot here to dupe everybody. They had reliable memories because this was a big deal. You know, most of us who were alive during 9/11 remember very clearly that day. A life-changing event causes you to remember things very well. And the gospel writers, the ones who remembered this, they had good memories because they had been through this. This was a life-changing event for them. And the gospels talk about embarrassing details about them, which they're not going to put in if they're making this up. They were written, of course, like by eyewitnesses, and they are historically reliable, where we have dates and things. And so there's many reasons that we should believe that the gospel writers could be trusted. So they had seen the risen Christ. They were eyewitnesses to him. But you might say, oh, wait a minute here. These guys were Christians. Of course that they claim that Jesus rose from the dead. But remember, they weren't Christians before that necessarily. Some of them were following Jesus, but they didn't believe him really until after they saw the resurrected Christ. And then they were like, wow, I mean, he really is who he said that he was. Okay, so that was the gospel writers. We can look at them. They're eyewitnesses for the most part about the resurrection. Well, now the next group that we have is, well, there was, I forgot to give, that's the reasons why we trust the gospel writers there. We have the change in the disciples. The change in the disciples. These guys had transformed from a frightened group of men who were hiding behind locked doors when Jesus died. They'd been following him, right? And now they were hiding because he's dead. And what are they going to think about us? Are they going to come for us next? And when they saw the risen Jesus, it totally transformed their lives. They became totally different people and were willing to give their lives. Now, that obviously doesn't prove that it was true, but it proves that they knew that it was true, that they believed that it was true. I want to read something to you. This is from Justice Antonin Scalia, obviously before he died. He said this at a prayer breakfast. I thought this was a great quote. He said, everything from Easter morning to the ascension had to be made up by groveling enthusiasts as part of their plan to get themselves martyred. That is, of course, if they made this whole thing up. You're not going to make up something that's going to get you martyred like that. You're not going to make up something that's going to make you be an outcast in society if you really didn't believe it. That would just be crazy. But that's obviously what some people say. So the next group that we see, the eyewitnesses that we have, were multiple eyewitnesses. And Paul talked about this. He said many, many people saw the risen Christ. If we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5, he says, and that he was seen by Cephas, talking about Jesus. He was seen by Cephas, that's Peter, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me also as one born out of due time. So he goes to list these people. Peter, Cephas, he saw the risen Christ. The 12, he's talking about the disciples here. And obviously at this point, Judas was gone, but they still were known by the 12. And he said 500 people at one time that Paul could actually go to and talk to. Hey, did you see the risen Christ? And they would say, yes, we sure did. James, the brother of Jesus, it picks him out. This is most likely the brother of Jesus because he's picked out, especially James was not a believer in Jesus. He was one of Jesus' brothers. He was going to believe that about their brother, right? But he became a believer afterwards and then became one of the great leaders in the early church, maybe the leader in the church in Jerusalem. And then he mentions all the apostles. He already mentioned the 12. Now he mentions, probably talking about a later group. Sometime other people were also called apostles. Maybe the whole group that was standing there on the mountain when Jesus rose back to heaven. Don't know. But Paul is just saying there's so many people that saw the risen Christ. Then he says, I myself, even though I came along later and I wasn't there in Jerusalem when Jesus died and when he rose, but I saw him on the road to Damascus. And he mentions the women, which of course is important because people didn't trust the testimony of women, so they're not going to make this up. But he says, you can go to the women. And then of course later we see, I guess he didn't actually mention the women there, but we know through the Bible that that the women did see Jesus. And why would they add this into the Gospels if it wasn't true, right? And then, of course, we have the two men on the road to Emmaus, and they also saw Jesus. So we have all this testimony. We have so many people. 500, just Paul mentions at one time. And then the list, the apostles, Paul, we have the women, we have the men on the road to Emmaus. So many people saw the risen Christ. There is plenty of eyewitness testimony to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. So the gospel writers, they were either eyewitnesses or they interviewed eyewitnesses. The disciples changed. Many people saw Jesus, even many of them at the same time, which obviously brings up the question of, did they hallucinate? Were they making this up? I want you to watch my next video when I have it posted, hopefully very soon, because we're going to talk about that. Could this have been hallucinations? God bless you guys, and I will see you in the next video.